Thank you for having me here. This is a joint work with Cynthia Bansek from St. Lawrence University. And the title is Grandparents as a Good Substitute for Parents as a Primary Caregiver, the Impact of Grandparents on Children's Human Capital. In this paper, we try to assess the impact of grandparents being the primary caregiver on the level of human capital of grandparents. We will measure the human capital by standardized math and Chinese test scores and the health measures. And further, we will explore the potential channels. We are going to use pooled OIS and IV method to test for the overall effect of grandparents. And the data we use is from the China Family Panel Studies, 2010 and 2014 waves. For the channels, we particularly look at the grandparents' education and the grandparents' parenting styles. And lastly, we explore the heterogeneity. We perform analysis by age and gender of the child. So here is a preview of our main findings. So by using the pooled OIS and the instrumental variable estimates, we find evidence that the grandparents being the primary caregiver overall have a negative effect on the level of human capital of their grandchildren. And this is both measured in terms of education and in terms of health. And for heterogeneities, we found that younger children and boys seems to suffer the most. And therefore, grandparents may not be substituting well for parents. For the mechanism, we found that the education of grandparents play an important role in the success of grandchildren. And the increased schooling of grandparents can mitigate the negative effect of grandparents being the primary caregiver. And in addition, the parenting practice of grandparents are different, and this may be detrimental to grandchildren's childhood development. So now I'm going to briefly review the literature. The literature on the overall impact of grandparents on education of grandchildren is mixed. And those studies mostly focus on grandparents' co-residency. Some studies look at the role of the grandparents implicitly by looking at the household structure. For example, Harvey, 2020, found that there's no significant effect of co-residence with grandparents on childhood outcomes. And we found two studies in China, both found positive effect. In particular, for example, Wang, 2020, found that compared to left behind children living with their mother, those living with mother and grandparents tend to do better in terms of math and Chinese test scores. So this shows a complementary role of grandparents in the household. Though not stated implicitly in their paper, this paper by Mansour and Elder, 2011, compares the complementary role and the substitutive role of grandparents in the household. Particularly, they found that in single mother households, co-residence with grandparents is beneficial, which shows a complementary role of grandparents. But in skipped generation household, co-residency with grandparents is negatively associated with educational outcome of those grandchildren. There's a negative effect for substitutive role of grandparents in the household. Therefore, we have our hypothesis one. Grandparents are not a good substitute for parents in taking care of children in terms of their academic needs. Here we emphasize the substitutive role of grandparents because of a key variable of interest is grandparents being the primary caregiver. And our study also related to the literature on intergenerational transmission of education. The finding again is mixed. For example, those studies on developed country and area mostly found positive effect, with some exception. For example, Bo and Coleman, 2016, found no effect for of grandparents' resources, including education on grandchildren's schooling. And a few study on developing countries. For example, this one by Arenas, 2017, found that in Mexico, where the education of older cohorts are fairly low, grandparents' education is not associated with grandchildren's school progression. And we found two studies on China, particularly this one by Zheng and Xie, 2014, find educational level of co-resident grandparents directly affect the educational attainment of their grandchildren. And the size of the effect is similar to that of parental education. And they further attribute this positive effect to social-psychological pathway between grandparents and grandchildren. And therefore, we have our hypothesis 2. We think that the lower education of grandparents relative to parents is one of the cause of the negative effect of grandparents as a primary caregiver on children's academic performance. Further, we look at the grandparents' parenting style. Parenting style is defined as parents' control over and approach to disciplining their children. And normally it's measured in 2 dimensions. The demandingness is measures the number of demands made by parents, and the responsiveness, which measures the nature of the parental reinforcement. In the extreme cases, low levels of both demandingness and responsiveness result in disengaged parenting, which has been linked to low school attainment of the child. And high level of both demandingness and responsiveness result in authoritative parenting, which is associated with children's better social, cognitive, and behavioral developmental outcomes. And in China, we find grandparents' parenting style are quite different from those of parents. For example, Yue, 2019, found that in rural Shanxi, the grandmother parenting is less effective than the mother's, as she does not engage with children in a way that encourage early development. For example, the grandmother does not sing or tell story or play toys with the child. And Li, 2019, found that in urban China, in Jiangsu province, grandparenting style, especially grandparental care, was prone to overprotection, which could lead to a child's emotional and behavioral problems. And Go also found that grandparents are too lenient and indulgent towards the grandchildren, and it is the parents who play the disciplinary role in the household. Therefore, we have our hypothesis 3. Grandparents has less effective parenting style, which will have a negative effect on the grandchildren's educational outcome. The next aspects we look at on grandchildren is health. And there again has mixed result for the studies on the impact of grandparents on health of grandchildren. Particularly, we also look at health-related parenting practice, especially feeding practice. And we found that in China, grandparents being the caregiver are more likely to associate it with grandchildren's unhealthy diet, such as lack food diversity and sugary snacks, and other worse feeding practices. And some studies attribute to those feeding or parenting practice related to health to misconception of grandparents regarding to being healthy and their beliefs about healthy eating. Therefore, we have our hypothesis related to health. Hypothesis 4 states that grandparents as a primary caregiver will negatively affect children's health. And 5 and 6 we propose the channels. So we believe that grandparents' feeding practice are unhealthy for the child, and their low education and poor nutritional knowledge will result in adverse health outcome for the grandchildren. Next, about methodology. So equation 1 shows our main regression. The y is the outcome variable, which is the test score for education, and some health indicator, including obesity, underweight, height for age, Z-score, being the frequency of being sick and doctor's visit. And our key variable of interest is grandparents being the primary caregiver instead of parents. And we control for the individual characteristics, the community characteristics, and the county fixed effect, the year fixed effect. And for the channels, we include the channel variable in our main regression, and we look at the change in beta. So if this beta becomes more towards to 0 and become less significant, we believe this is an effective channel. We look at both the OS and IV estimation. And for the IVs, we use a number of parents, brothers, and sisters as a potential IV for grandparents being the primary caregiver.
Sorry, Sophie, there's a question. Milena?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask how you exactly are defining this, the main caregiver. So is it a particular share of the time that the grandparent is taking care? And I'm asking because I'm wondering whether it is part of the channels that you're identifying are due to just the pure absence of the parent, although the so suppose that the parent is working somewhere else and they see the child very infrequently, and that of course causes pain of separation and yeah, maybe depression. So to what extent is to what extent can you distinguish between the complete absence of the parent from and the psychological trauma of that for health and for educational outcomes?
Yeah, I understand this is an important question because this is about our key variable of interest. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this variable more probably in the next slide. But here I can say something about this key variable. Actually, the survey, the China Family Panel Study, it provides a question regarding to this. It asks directly who's the primary caregiver for this child in the past months. So we mainly use this variable to define who's the primary caregiver.
And do you know if the parent is also maybe living in the household or somewhere else?
Yeah, I'm going to talk more about the sample. Actually, in our sample, the parents are all married and they are all alive and they are not in prison. And, but they may be busy working. So that's true. And they may work in another city or even in another province. That's possible. So we may have left behind children in our sample, but the parents, they are both alive and married and not in prison. So the grandparents being the primary caregiver is quite different. So in our case, quite different from the grandparents being the primary caregiver for example, in the US. Because in the US, I noticed that, so the main reason for the grandparents being the primary caregiver or take over the guardianship is because the parents are incarcerated or deceased or divorced. In our case, it's quite different. It's mostly because the parents are busy working. Should I continue?
I think Klaus has a question. Good.
Can I maybe just add a quick question of understanding? Now, there might be indirect effects, yes? So let's say the grandparent is there and the parents can, well, the wife, for instance, can now work, yes? And work brings income and also experience. And so this may affect the life of the kid indirectly. Can go to a better school or whatever. I mean, get an outside teacher or whatever. I'm just inventing things. These indirect effects, are they taken out? Are you controlling for, let's say, income and the situation of the parents?
Yes, we do control for the individual characteristics in X. For example, the parents' education, the household income, the number of siblings, and the parents, the father's occupation. No.
Take out positive effects of grandparenting. Grandparenting helps the household to produce better. Yes.
Yeah, we if the parents working out, yeah, it's possibly to have positive effects because there will be more household income, right? So we do control for that.
You take it out. You don't. Yeah, by controlling, you take it out.
Yes.
You ignore
that's
it.
True.
Ignore it. Yes. You don't. What the effect you observe is a poor direct effect of grandparenting, not the indirect effects. You get my point?
So you mean I shouldn't take out the income effect? Is that your point?
I don't know how you handle it, but when at the end you say, oh, it's all negative, the point is this is by construction already negative, because all the positive effects which are operating indirectly, yes, are taken out. You eliminate it.
No, actually, it's not necessarily depend on the samples. In our sample, yeah, it's negative effect, but in other studies, they use the same structure and they find positive effect because in their cases, for example, the case in the US, the grandparents may have more education, and being around with more educated grandparents or richer grandparents, they may have a positive effect to the child. And another study actually in China by Fabio, 1991. He actually found a positive effect of co-residence with grandparents because they believe at that time, grandparents are more educated than parents because the parents were naturally affected by the Cultural Revolution. So the parents have lower education than grandparents.
Yeah, but that's all fine. But this is not my point. This is no answer to my point. This is a different issue. If there's these indirect effects, we are talking about direct effects. If grandparents are better educated, they perform maybe positive. Yes, fine. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there are indirect effects, which you will. I'm just making my point now. I'm quiet now. So the indirect effects are taken out. You have a bias in the overall.
Which aspect of the individual effect?
Well, if grandparenting gives the household the chance to have a higher income, yes, you ignore the positive effect of a higher income on a child performance because you control higher income. You take it out. It's not included. You have not a system where we have an indirect effect of say grandparenting on higher income and from higher income to child performance.
Yeah, I see your point, but but we believe the causality work this way. So it's because the parents are busy working and therefore the grandparents step in to be the primary caregiver. And it is the parents who busy working which result in higher income. It's not necessarily the grandparents being the primary caregiver result in the higher income.
Maybe we can talk more a bit later. I'm just kind of conscious of, I want Sophie to finish the talk. Xiaobing, if you have a very quick question, maybe we can, and Teresa, you have raised your hand. Maybe, one more minute for interaction. Xiaobing?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the key question we are raising here, for example, Klaus' question is that in your hypothesis, it's all negative impact. But what we are discussing or what we are thinking is there may be positive impact that you are ignoring. For example, like the grandparents help that will enable the parents to go to the labor market. For example, without grandparents providing childcare, the parents won't be able to participate in the labor market. And because of they stepped in, so they are able now to work so that you have some income effects, and this may not be negative. So you may not capturing this. So this is what I'm thinking. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's discuss more of this at the end. This is basically what Klaus's point was. Teresa, very quick.
I got it.
I'm just wondering if you have done some heterogeneous analysis, running the regression by groups, like those who are both parents working full-time, or whether they are high income or low income. So in this way, you could really disentangle if there is some positive effect or not. So what I suggest is an heterogeneous analysis by groups, and also by age. I don't know if I lost it, but I didn't understand which age of children you are considering. So maybe you could even split the sample for those who are younger and those who are older to see if the effect of these grandparents as a primary caregiver is always the same.
Okay. Yeah, actually, that's a good suggestion. So probably we will test by income group and employment status, and to see whether there's a employment channel. So the grandparents enable the parents to work full-time. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm going to continue with the IVs. So we believe that the number, so that the intuition of those IVs is like this. So if the parents have more brothers and sisters, then their children will compete for the grandparents' caregiving with this child. And thus, this child will be less likely to have grandparents being the primary caregiver. And especially the number of parents, brothers, and sisters is exogenous, is predetermined. And in addition, by controlling the family characteristics, such as the parents' education, the household income, and the father's occupation, so we can have those IVs do not have direct effect on the outcomes of the child. Next, I'm going to talk about the data. So the data we use is from the China Family Panel Studies. We use the 2010 and 2014 waves. So this is a national representative survey which collect information on demographics, economic activities, education, and health outcomes. And our key variable of interest is caregiving. So as I said, there's a direct question in the questionnaire which asked who's the primary caregiver for this child in the past months. And we use this variable to define who's the primary caregiver, whether it's the grandparents versus parents. And this question is asked for children aged between 0 and 15. In addition, for the dependent variable, we have test scores, obesity, underweight, height for age, Z-score, the frequency of being sick, and doctor's visit. So the first one measures the education aspect, and the others measures the health aspects. So for the test score, the CIPS provide a standardized math and Chinese word test. And those tests were provided for individuals who are age 10 and above. And therefore, for our education result, we have the sample of children aged between 10 to 15. So we normalize those test scores into this score by age, and we take the mean of those Chinese words and math tests into an average test score. And for health, we have obesity, which take the value of 1 if the child is greater than 2 standard deviation above the WHO standard for average BMI by age and by gender. We have underweight, which take the value of 1 if the child is more than 2 standard deviation below the WHO standard for average BMI for age and gender. And we have height for age z-score, which is a normalized measure for height for age according to the WHO height measure for the child's age and gender. And we have sick times, which is a continuous measure, captures the number of times the child was sick last month. And lastly, we have doctor's visit, which is also a continuous variable, measures how many times the child went to see a doctor due to illness in the past year. And for controls, we control for the child's individual characteristics, the household characteristics, and the community characteristics. And then in addition, we control for the county fixed effect and year fixed effect. The characteristics include the child's age, gender, hukou status, ethnicity, the parent's year of education, the left behind child status, log of household per capita income, and for the education outcome, we further control the father's occupation. And for health outcome, we control for the child's birth weight, medical insurance status, and the parent's BMI or height status. So this is the education sample, summary statistics. So this is children aged between 10 to 15, and we have 3,789 individuals. In our sample, the majority are taken care by mother, so 68%, and followed by taken care of by grandparents, 22%, followed by taken care of by father, which is less than 10%. If you look here, children who are mainly taken care of by grandparents, they have lower test score than those taken care of by parents. But this difference is not statistically significant. And further, if we look at the characteristics, we can see that children who are primarily taken care of by grandparents are more likely to be left behind children, younger, have live in rural area, have fewer siblings, and their parents are more likely to have more education. And their father are more likely to be the leading country and self-employed, being worker, and less likely to be the farmer. So you can see those are the busy working people. And in addition, if you look at our IEs, you can see that they are both negatively associated with the child being primarily taken care of by grandparents. So this is the sample for health outcome. Again, the children are mostly taken care of by mother. So those children are younger from age 10 to 15, and therefore the average age is younger. So higher percentage are taken care of by mother, about 64%, followed by grandparents, about 31%, followed by father, less than 5%. And being taken care of by grandparents are more likely to associate with being obese, having more frequent doctor visit, and more frequently being sick. And for the channels, we look at breastfeeding for 6 months or more, diet diversity, which is an index by adding all different kind of food the child had in a week. And in particular, we look at whether there is vegetable and fruit in the child's diet. And they are all negatively associated with grandparents being the primary caregiver. The characteristics are similar to the previous sample, so I'm going to skip this. So this is our main result. This is the main result for the health, for the education outcome. So in the first 3 columns, those are the estimates from the OLS regression. And the 4th column shows the IV result. And in the last column, we show the reduced form regression. So from the OLS result, we can see that grandparents being the primary caregiver is negatively associated with the child's test scores. And the IV result is consistent with the OLS result. Especially if we look at the first stage, you can see that all our IVs are significantly negative with negative related to grandparenting. And it passed the over identification test. The F status is also good at 37, which is way above 10. In addition, to show that our IV is valid, especially the exclusion restriction, we include those IVs in our main regression to see that they do not have a direct effect on the children's educational outcome besides its channels through the grandparents being the primary caregiver. And it is true, so those IV variables are never significant. And the coefficient on grandparents barely change. So this confirm our hypothesis one. Having a grandparents as the primary caregiver instead of parents has a negative effect on children's standardized mean test score and therefore have a negative effect on children's educational outcome. Next, we are going to test the education channel. So now we include the difference in the education of parents and caring grandparents and the grandparents' mean year of education in the regression. So by include those grandparents' educational variables, the grandparents being the primary caregiver is not significant anymore, and the magnitude of the effect is much smaller. And therefore, this shows that grandparents' lower education has a significant negative effect compared to parents on the children's educational outcome. And the marginal effect is at 0.018.
Sophie, there's a question.
Yeah.
Xiaobing?
Hello, hi. Sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering, perhaps you are capturing the wrong sort of effects. So my feeling is this. So how do you distinguish those parents and grandparents? For example, if because in a survey you only have one question saying are the grandparents the primary caretakers. So there are two scenarios we have to distinguish. One is parents, they take care of the grandchild, but also the parents is there to help. So this is one scenario. Another scenario is the parents is working somewhere else. And the grandparents, they are the sole caretakers of the child. And in this case, the effect that you are capturing may not be whether adding grandparents is good or bad, but because when the grandparents is taking care of their grandchildren in absence of the parents, this is the typical sort of left behind children problem, where the low care quality is not because of grandparents, but because the lack of sufficient child care, because grandparents, they have their own things to do, or they are not paying enough attention to those. So how do you distinguish these two, please? Can you clarify before we move on?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we do control for the left behind child status here, and you can see that it's never significant in all the specifications. And actually, we also try to interact the grandparents being the primary caregiver with the left behind children status, and it is also never significant. So we didn't report that result. So it seems that this is not an effective factor here.
Okay, so just want to make very quick to, if you can separate the two types of household, i.e. the parents taking care of the grandparents taking care of their children together with the parents, or they are the sole child care provider. So this may, you may want to just do a robust test to test whether this is robust or not, separating those two type of household. This is just a suggestion, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, I also consider that, but the problem is, remember the left behind children is about 10% of our sample, and among those children, about half of them, so actually less than half of them, they have both parents away, and therefore the sample size for those children is very small. So that's the case you are talking about. The grandparents are the sole caregiver. But in other cases, it's like the case in the other paper, the grandparents and the mother are the caregiver. So that's not the case you are talking about, right? So my main point is, if we separate the sample for the case that the parents are both away, the sample size is quite small. It's like 100 or so. So it's the statistics, the regression and the statistics will be not meaningful. And therefore, we look at the full sample and by including those variables here, and also we look at the interaction terms, but it's not significant. Further, to test for the educational channel, we do some falsification test. So if the grandparents' low education is the culprit for low test scores, then by excluding those low educated grandparents, the grandparents being the primary caregiver may not have a significant effect. And therefore, we exclude the grandparents who have lower than 4.5 years of education. So in this way, the remaining caregiving grandparents will have 6.9 years of education, which is, remember the mean year of education for parents is 6.9. But if we deleting the grandparents who have low education, then the corresponding parents, their education also increased. So the resulting sample, the corresponding parents, they will have about 8.4 years of education, so which is still 1 year difference. Therefore, we further delete the grandparents who have less than 6 years of education. And in this way, the average year of education of caregiving grandparents will be about 7.8, and the corresponding parents, their years of education is 8.6. So the difference now is less than 1 year. In both of the subsamples, we found that grandparents being the primary caregiver do not have a significant negative effect anymore. And the marginal effect is much smaller compared to our main sample. This further confirmed that the education of the grandparents, especially their low education compared to the parents, result in the negative effect. So this confirms our hypothesis too. So the education of grandparents is an important channel. Next, we look at the parenting practice, especially the learning-related parenting style. We look at the two dimensions, demandingness and the responsiveness. The demandingness is measured by 3 questions: whether the guardian asks the child to finish homework, check their homework, restrict them from TV. And the responsiveness also measured by 3 questions: whether the guardian discuss school with child, care about the child's education, communicate with the child. And from the summary statistic, you can see that all those individual measures are related to, negatively related to the grandparents being the primary caregiver. We look at those measures individually so that if they get consistent result, any way to compile those into an index will give us the same qualitative result. So here's the regression result. The controls are the same as in our main table, column 3. And you can see that grandparents, again, is negatively associated with the demandingness measure and the responsiveness measure. And therefore, we conclude that the grandparents adopt a disengaged parenting scale. And we know from the literature that those disengaged parenting style is associated with lower educational attainment and lower cognitive ability. And therefore, we confirm our hypothesis 3. So grandparents' parenting style are less effective in promoting the child's education. This next table shows the heterogeneity effect between boys and girls. And grandparents being the primary caregiver has a significant negative effect for boys, but the effect is not significant for girls. Next, I'm going to show the health outcome. First, for obesity. This sample is for children aged between 0 to 15. Grandparents being the primary caregiver is possibly associated with the child being obese, especially for those aged between 2 to 5. And the grandparents being the primary caregiver is associated with the child being underweight for children aged between 10 to 15. It is also associated with lower height for age for boys. It is also positively associated with the child being more frequently being sick for children aged between 0 to 1. And it is positively associated with more frequent doctor visit, especially those aged between 0 and 1 and for girls. And therefore, we conclude that those provide evidence for our hypothesis 4, that grandparents being the primary caregiver is associated with negative health outcome for their grandchildren. Next, we look at potential channels. So we look at some feeding practices as the literature suggests. So we look at the breastfeeding, especially breastfeeding for 6 months or above, the diet diversity, which is an index we generate by compiling the different diet they have in the past week. Especially we look at the vegetable and the fruit in that. And we can see that grandparents being the primary caregiver is negatively associated with all the 3 feeding practice variables. And those variables, those feeding practice variables are associated with obesity, lower height for age visible, frequency of being sick, and the doctor's visit. And therefore, it provides the evidence for our hypothesis 5 that the ineffective parenting style and feeding practice result in the negative effect in children's health. Lastly, we look at the education channel. So we include the difference in the education of parents and grandparents in the regression. And we focus on the coefficient of, or the effect of grandparents as primary caregiver. We can see that the coefficient become closer to 0 and the significant become less. Therefore, we conclude that the grandparents' education is also an important channel, which may result in lower health measures of the grandchildren. Lastly, let me conclude. So we are the first to examine the susceptibility of caregiving by grandparents, and we found a significant negative effect, indicating that grandparents compromise the human capital of youth in their care. Especially, we found that the declines are noteworthy for younger children and for boys. And we attribute the negative effect of grandparents being the primary caregiver to their low education compared to parents and their ineffective parenting and feeding practices. Thank you, that's all.
Right, questions?
Okay, can I very quickly ask a question before I go, because I have a first lecture that
Sure.
I need to go. All right, so my major concern is very similar to what I just raised, actually. So my worry is that you find all this negative impact and then there's no positive one. I mean, this shocked me a little bit, because normally we understand if grandparents come to help, they will have some sort of positive impact. Can you explain to me why this is counterintuitive, your result?
Actually, it's like this. So for the overall effect, we find is negative, and for the channels, yes, we do focus on the channels that may result in the negative outcomes. So if we there may be some other channels that can result in some positive effect, but here because our overall effect is negative, and therefore we here we only focus on the negative channels, which can potentially explain our overall effect.
So okay, so let me put it another way. So let's say if they are negative, why don't you just withdraw grandparents' care? I mean, I'm being naive here, so I'm just deliberately asking those kind of questions, basically saying, if it's negative, why just withdraw them? Don't allow them to take care of the kid.
Yeah, the reason is because the parents busy working, they don't have time, they can't quit their job, they can't leave early, they can't. So some parents, they, for example, they work in the cities, that's the left behind children case, and some children, their parents live in the same city, but they come back from work, probably arrive home at 8 or 9 o'clock. The child is almost go to sleep.
Yeah, so this is exactly the positive impact. I mean, of course, you don't look at this, but we have to. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we try to control for the household income, to control for the income effect.
Well,
Class?
we are talking all the time around the same point. In basically, there is, of course, there must be a positive effect, but the positive effect is not on children, but it's on other people. Let's say like parents. Yes, if they have an advantage, they will still do it. Yes, so at least as long as we believe in the rational behavior and welfare maximization of the whole family. Yes, so that of course they could be irrational also, but they do something. The grandparents force parents to take over. Yes, this could be the case. So everybody is under force. But well, this could be another explanation. But if not, there must be something positive, and the positive is not observed in this paper. This must not be a problem, as long as it's clearly worked out that one is only looking at the partial effect, not on the total effect. So if the conclusion would be society should avoid grandparenting, yes, because this is a disaster, that would be a little bit too fast a conclusion, I would argue.
Actually, I just quickly look at the per capita household income, and it seems that there's no significant difference between the household of children who are primarily taken care of by grandparents and those by parents. You can see there's no significant difference. So probably the income effect is not that big. But from here, you can see that especially the father, they do take a more busy role in their work. You can see they are more likely to be the leading caregiver and self-employed and being being a worker instead of a farmer who may have more flexible working time.
Okay. Elsa, you want to?
But yeah, actually, as another point, we don't believe the father, they will change their occupation is just because the grandparents being the primary caregiver or not, right?
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. Just to add on the previous point, maybe this paper is ignoring a little bit the selection issues related to those kind of living arrangement. Like it's not it's a significant thing to live with in a 3-generational household, and it might appear after some such event, an event. And for what I found in Ghana, this living arrangement, that when the child is living with the grandparents without the parents, is mainly linked with the dissolution of the parental union. Like the children are not staying with the diverse parent, and then they go to live with their grandparents. So if you compare children having those kind of marital parental instability with those living with the grandparents, you find a very positive, significant effect of the grandparenting. So it might be also due to the fact that the paper is not targeting the selection issues related to living arrangement.
We do consider the living arrangement. We try to look at the co-residence of grandparents. It seems that in our sample, there is a high percentage of children co-reside with grandparents, and the correlation coefficient between grandparents being the primary caregiver and grandparents co-residence is about 0.3. We try to include this grandparents co-residency variable in our main regression, and it's not significant. And we also try to also use grandparents co-residency as a key variable instead of grandparents being the primary caregiver. And the result is also not significant. So we believe the grandparents being the grandparents co-residency is not that important in determining our outcome variable. And we focus on the role of the grandparents in the household, which is the primary caregiver. We think that's a more important issue. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, in that case, we'll stop here. Thank you so much, Sophie, for a very
Thank you
presentation
for having me here.
Yeah.